So, welcome. This would not be any fun unless I share with you some pictures. And then I'm going to just remove the like that. Yes, welcome to this digital art and Bible tour in the Nordic Bible Museum. My name is Bente Paus and I'm volunteering at the museum as a guide. We're going back many years and covering many centuries during this short hour we're together. So hold on to your hats and let's get started. So a picture says more than 1,000 words, the saying goes. And considering all the words in the Bible, one can understand that it can be nice to have something that resonates with a story in an instant. But when did that start? Or when did they start decorating handwritten texts? Remember that originally the whole Bible is written by hand, just like oil paintings are made by hand. We're going to get a historical overview first, then we shall look at the Bibles that the museum has that contain art, and finally we'll take a tour with the speed of light in familiar motifs, all within the next hour. So let's get our historical overview. A youngster that visited the museum asked me once, were pictures actually allowed in the Bible? Don't the 10 Commandments say something about not to make a picture of anything? So just to have that established, here's the quote from the King James Bible of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth underneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. That's a lot of thys and those. So the ban applied to worshipping images. And the prohibition was later extended by priests and scribes to apply to drawings in the Hebrew religious manuscripts. And one would probably do that even today, whether in Sunday school or standing confirmation, to draw irreverently in the Bible would be frowned upon, I suppose. So that's the commandment. But when the 10 Commandments were given, they also received a mission of making the tabernacle, as we see a picture of here, a tent for worship, a meeting point between God and man. And they were told to embroider cherubs on the fabric walls of the tent. Also upon the Ark of the Covenant, which you see at the far end, the ark that contained the 10 Commandments inside, the craftsmen were told to make golden cherubs on the lid of the ark. This does not mean that the Jews engaged in angel worship. In fact, no other than the high priest saw the Ark of the Covenant. And he only saw it once a year when he went into the Most Holy. So arts and crafts were certainly present from the time the worship was organized into formal forms, and a place of such worship was made by the creation of the tabernacle, and 500 years later, the temple. When it comes to art in the Bible, it also helps us to distinguish between manuscripts or handwritings and printed material. So we know that the Bible was originally written in mainly Hebrew and Greek and somewhat Aramaic, and then transcribed by hand. This happened from about 1500 before Common Era and right up until Gutenberg's time. He was born 1400 Common Era, so a period of nearly 3,000 years. For those of you who took part in the lecture on the Dead Sea Scrolls will remember how exciting the discovery of this were, as they were 1,000 years older than the manuscripts already available. So the chance to see how much had changed in all those years of transcription was quite thrilling. If you've not seen it yet, do so. It's available on our YouTube channel and also on the Nordic Bible Museum's website. It really strengthens our respect for those entrusted with the task of keeping these writings for the generations to come. Now, art and the Bible. As mentioned, it was forbidden for Jews to draw in Hebrew manuscripts. A transcriber or a copyist bypassed this by using a sentence and making it into a word animal at the bottom of the page. In the Hebrew text you see here to the left, we see a text with footnotes in the margin to point out changes in the phrasing or choice of words. When they started with drawings, it was with the use of words. Let me show you. Ta-da. So nobody can say it's a drawing. Well, it is, but it's words. So what they did was they would form a sentence. This is a little copy that I've made myself. The original is from around the year 400. It's found in a Masorah, old Hebrew manuscript. I've made up the sentence. It just says, following this text around, it shows you how such word animals were made and give you an understanding of how they earlier used these ways to decorate a text that otherwise would be completely without illustrations. So that's how they got around it. Moving further on in time, to the year 1008 Common Era, we find the Leningrad Codex. It's known to be the oldest complete Bible translation in Hebrew. And so in addition to being of importance both historically and religiously, it is the best example from the Middle Ages, that is from the 5th century to the Renaissance. The Leningrad Codex is also evidence that the Bible has not changed in those 1,000 years since it was put to paper. And if you took a trip 600 years later to Amsterdam, you'd find this little book with Psalms, where you have both in Dutch and in Hebrew, a Biblia Hebraica. And they've adorned it at the top with some flower boards. Now, so this is Hebrew scriptures. What about Christian literature? In the 400s, Common Era, they'd come further in Christian art than in the Hebrew department, as we can see here. This is called the Quedlinburg Itala. It was first discovered in 1865 in a German city called Quedlinburg. And they'd used this piece of paper as a filling material in a rebinding of a book. So these illustrations, when they were found, they were 1,300 years old. And we can see a glimpse of a text. It is a translation in Latin, a very early one, probably 2nd century, used by Christians until Jerome made his official translation into Latin, which was in 405. The find in Quedlinburg are 6 sheets or folios containing texts and large Bible passages and illustrations. A folio is the largest sheet that you can use when making books, and you can fold it in the middle and then several times over and then cut up the edges. The text we glimpse here, very hard, can't read it really, but it is from 1st and 2nd Samuel and the 1st book of Kings. And this illustration then was made between 420 and 430 in Rome. Today, we can find it in the State Library in Berlin. And we see 4 pictures. A German librarian, Edith Roth, who has written about illuminated texts, which this is what's called, she writes of this picture that the Roman costumes, the altar, and the carriage clearly show how early Christian art was influenced by pagan secular art, end of quote. So although they illustrate things that happened 1,000 years ago, they used contemporary clothing and religious symbols in their illustrations. And there was a huge difference in the altar, in the clothing, in the two vastly different religions, Judaism and Roman worship. But how was this picture made? Well, first they wrote the text that was supposed to be in, and then space were allocated for the miniatures. A miniature was originally something written or drawn with red dye. If there was a whole sentence that said something important, it was written in red. As we can see here in a Bible that highlights Jesus's own words. So the guy who did that job, he was called a rubricator. And such a person was a specialized scribe who received text from the original scribe. Rubrication was one of several steps in the medieval process of manuscript making. And the term comes from Latin, of course, from rubicare, the color red. And this practice actually began in Egypt during the pharaohs, where the scribes emphasizing important texts, such as headings or new parts of a narrative, etc., on the papyri using red ink. Now, if a small drawing was to be made, either inside a letter or elsewhere on the sheet, one had to be helped by someone who was a miniator, an illuminator. He was going to make the text luminous, either using red font, as we can see at the subheadings, or he could use gold, or he could make small paintings. Here we find the origin of what is this art form is called illumination. So an illumination is a handmade book illustration performed on parchment, most often painted with gouache or tempera, and of course gold, which made the illustration sparkle and glow. And when I say gouache and tempera, you might not have a clue what that is, so let me show you. Isn't it gorgeous? All the gold, all the detail gone into it. Handwritten, hand done. Gorgeous. Here we see an example of gouache and an example of tempera. To the left, view from the cross, Jesus looking down on the people. So they use a white dye like chalk or zinc in water so that it covers properly. But it doesn't look like a watercolor, does it? Because of the chalk. And to the right, Jerome, when he was translating the Bible into Latin, what they used then was they blended the dry colors with egg. And it made it really strong colors. And the egg, of course, then made it stick to paper or the canvas or the parchment that they used. Now, we see then that an illuminator, he knew more about the artwork than a rubricator. He was consulted and then wrote which illustrations were to be included in the frames. When these were finished, one wrote picture explanations outside the frame. And these miniature painters, they could be monks in monasteries, but not all monasteries had anyone that were good enough. So there were also traveling miniature painters until about 1200. We don't know their names except for a very few, because just like a carpenter, they didn't sign their work. So now that we have a little historical overview, which Bibles does the museum have that contains art or decorations? Let's look at how the Bible has been adorned and its stories rendered artistically over the years. So the oldest handwritten page that the museum has is made in Paris. It's from 1250, Common Era. This is not printed. This is handwritten. Amazing penmanship. We see a typical way to beautify the page. the initial letter in blue and red, adorned with lines down, and they've blended in some red even in some letters further down. If we look at John Wycliffe's Bible, he translated it into English between 1382 and 1395, also handwritten, and the original copy, this is what do you call it? Forget the word. Yeah, a copy. The original one also had red and white, red and blue in the letters that you see here. If we move on to Tyndale's version, which was translated from the Greek into English, this was printed after a while. This is also a facsimile. We see several colors, and they've even made a little, the illuminator has been at work. He's made a little picture of Peter and John writing and giving the messages further on. Looking at King James, the famous King James Bible, printed in 1611, they adorn the initial letter, and you see the flower heading. And we can also make a point of that the original, the Bible text is in Gothic lettering, while the, losing my English now, introduction, the short explanation of what the chapter contains, that does not, that you won't find that in the original scriptures in Hebrew. So they've used Latin letters just to show the difference. Now, Martin Luther in Germany, he started translating the Bible into German, and around the same time it was as Tyndale, and he was helped by his very good friend Lucas Cranach the Elder, who made illustrations to Luther's Bible. He was a close friend of Martin Luther, and it's thanks to him that we know what Martin Luther looked like, because he made several portraits of him. And speaking of Cranach, we'll take a short trip to a Norwegian little town called Larvik, because in the church there, we find this original painting of Lucas Cranach, which really gives us a visual aid to the scripture about "Let the children come to me," his standard of painting. And Lucas Cranach was also the first one who painted an apple as the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. And due to that, and other artists copying him, people still today believe that Eve ate of an apple, although the Bible doesn't actually say what fruit it was. So he definitely took some artistic, what's the word? Freedoms in Norwegian. Now then, here we are. Moving on to another of Cranach's illustrations. If you've not guessed it, this is from the book of Revelation. This is Babylon the Great, the harlot, the prostitute, riding a many-headed animal. It says that the kings that we see to the left, they have lived in shameless luxury with the harlot and have become drunk of the wine she offers. So this is an illustration that both says something about the content of the Bible, as well as an introduction to the first chapter. Now, with Luther, we are over in the age of Reformation. And the Reformation was called a media revolution. There's another Luther Bible. Yes, a media revolution. In the mid-15th century, they They did mass produce books in block, pages that combine text and image. They would print calendars or time books, that is, books with prayers for the Virgin Mary to be prayed at certain times, preferably at 9 and noon and 3 p.m. And they would print playing cards. However, it was the composition of whole books printed with moving type which was revolutionary. The laborer's task of putting together separate letters, one by one, hand by hand. At first, they imitated manuscripts, as we see here. The original Paris Bible handwritten. We see Gutenberg's Bible. He's copied it exactly how the outline was in the handwritten Bible. And Gutenberg, he wanted to have, as we see, a red, a heading in red, and he would print then that first and then print the black. This proved too time consuming. So he left it blank and had somebody handwrite it in later. You can buy copies of pages of the Gutenberg Bible in the Web Museum shop. You can even buy a printed copy of the whole Bible. It's in 2 volumes with all wonderful illustrations. And this is such a facsimile, a reprint that you can buy. And what they used to do in the original as well is they would employ different artists, or the different printing places would have different artists. Some would be good at flowers, some would be good at animals. You could even have the wife's picture in one of the letters or in front of the Bible. So you could order different things to suit what you liked, how you liked it decorated. Now, we're going to look at the oldest Bible on display in our museum. This is a previously mentioned Vulgate Bible that Jerome translated. This one was printed about 1,000 years after Jerome first translated it. And we see how they adorn it, again, with red letters here and there, just to break up the text a little bit. Now, what about the first Nordic Bible? We are the Nordic Bible Museum after all. Well, if you've heard of Gustav Vasa, you might have heard of the Crackers Vasa or the Vasa ship. He decided, when he heard that Martin Luther had translated the Bible into German, to send 2 priests, they were fleshly brothers, and to go to Germany and translate the whole Bible from German into Swedish. And this was the first Bible in any Nordic language, local Nordic language. And he decided also that this would shape the Swedish language, decide what letters to use, that they this is where the decision to differ from Danish. This is why Swedish is so different from Danish and Norwegian, because of this translation. And another king, here we see the Bible, not just the image of it. Illustrations. Another Bible. It's called the front page, Biblia. It is all the holy writings in Swedish after Charles the 12th command. And you can see a little illustration of Moses at the bottom there, where he has the 10 commandments. You even see who gave it to him, because you see the light coming from above. And above, you see the divine name in Hebrew lettering, including the vocals. not just the consonants. And the light shone on Moses. And after he'd received the 10 Commandments, his light carried on shining, and the Hebrews, they got quite afraid. And so they asked him to put a covering over his face. And that's why it looks like his face doesn't really, you can't see the shape of his face. It's because he has a cloth over his face that the artist also have included in this illustration. Now, the first Bible in Norway was translated by Christian III. He decided that all churches in Denmark and Norway, because he was king over both countries, should have a Bible. And he was a personal pen pal with Martin Luther. And he had his friend Ludwig Dietz, another artist, make the illustrations. Ludwig Dietz came to Copenhagen to print the Danish Bible, so he brought with him the plates that he'd used to print Luther's other Bibles. His son, Frederick II, who founded Fredrikstad in Norway, and on a personal note is one of my ancestors, he wanted a bigger and better Bible than his father. So he thought, what can I do? Well, let's put a little color to it. Let's use some other woodcuts, another German artist called Virgil Sullis. Was he any good? Without a doubt. He had a production of over 2,000 prints and drawings. He was one of Nuremberg's most prolific print and book illustrators. He made over 200 woodcuts illustrating Bible stories, plus decorative elements. If you can imagine cutting into wood, all that you see here. If you ever try to cut into a potato and make a print. He copied other people. He copied Albrecht Dürer and Hans Holbein the Younger. And Hans Holbein one, you see to the right, is actually an English Bible. The Bible that is the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament. And even above here, you also see the Tetragrammaton. What about the first Norwegian Bible? The first Norwegian picture Bible? Well, we're back in Denmark here. Here we are. This was a guy called Hans Winter. He's from Norway. It's very cold here, so he's allowed to call Winter. He ran his own printing company in Christiania from 1826, but he gained the greatest importance as a lithographer. A lithographer is one who prints from a slab of stone, usually limestone. And we're going to see one later, and that can be bought in our museum shop. Winter, he published the first Norwegian picture Bible, supplied with steel engravings and original lithographies. Steel engravings first came into use in 1820, where you carve the motif into a steel plate, because steel can withstand far more impressions than copper and wood. Today, it's mostly used to print banknotes. So it says a little bit about how many prints you can get out of a steel plate. On a literary note, this Bible from 1837 is the Bible that Henrik Ibsen, a Norwegian author, read on a daily basis. And he said it strengthened him when he did not write his own stuff. Here's a beautiful illustration made by Julius Schnorr von Karlsfeld. Another Nordic Bible, one of the earlier ones. He was a German painter. He was heavily influenced by Italian High Renaissance. And this was an authorized version for both Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. As we said, a picture says more than 1,000 words. So which people with a complicated language have had a great need for a picture Bible to be able to access the Bible stories. In Greenland, Greenlandic is a very difficult language to translate. It was only in the year 2000, 22 years ago, that they received their first complete Bible in Greenlandic. Previous to that, they've had good use for, amongst others, this Bible, with illustrations by William Brassey Hall, who made a whole series of paintings on the life of Jesus of Nazareth. He was an English artist and illustrator. He traveled to Palestine to study the background of biblical painting, and he began 80 watercolors that would eventually appear as illustrations in his book, The Life of Jesus from Nazareth. He also painted illustrations from the Old Testament. To the left, we see two women standing in front of somebody important. One has a baby in her arms. The other one has put her baby on the floor because it died. To the right, we see Esther, who's having a party for her husband and the man who has tried to get her and her people killed. Moving on to one of the most famous Bible illustrators ever, a Frenchman called Gustav Dorea. He was actually a humor artist in French newspapers. He developed into an eminent artist after his graduation, and the method he used is called xylography. It's basically a woodcut, but the wood he uses is so hard that you can use a fine cutting tool to make the drawings and then put ink over it and print. So these are not pen stripes that you see, they are woodcuts. Amazing work. To the left, we see the deluge, and to the right, for some very famous story, a guy with a very long hair who told his sweetheart, his girlfriend at the time, the secret behind his strength. It had to do with his hair, so she cut it all off. That's how much she loved him. And we're going to add a little treasure. And after we've looked at this German Bible, also a cartoonist originally. And again, we see immense detail to point out what God has done for mankind, the light coming from above. Now to the treasure. This Bible is not on display, so this is a Zoom treat. It's also a German Bible. It's a facsimile, a copy from 1965, originally printed in 1731. It's called the Copper Bible, in which physical, sacred, and sacred natural science of the natural things that occur in the Holy Scriptures are clearly explained and proven. The guy who organized this Bible is the one you see to the left, John James. And he traveled a lot, and all the illustrations have at the bottom a scripture showing where they got the inspiration from. We see here Psalm 107 verse 3, where it says that, and gathered them out of the lands from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south. The purpose of this Bible, it was to prove God's existence by the natural science available at the time. It was published in 4 volumes, and it took 4 years to complete the printing of it. It had Bible text in Latin, in French and German, based on the King James Bible of 1611. There was two artists that helped each other out. Melchior Fuseli, he made sketches for the cover plates. He copied other artists. And John Daniel Preisler, who made the frames or the tables around the pictures. This illustrating when the sun and the moon stood still. The next Bible we're going to look at focused more on rendering the surroundings discussed in the Bible in a credible way. It's an English illustrated Bible, published in London. It has hundreds of woodcuts in texts and engraved plates in the steel engravings. And many of these engraved plates, they show biblical scenes and figures, while the engravings show views of Palestine and its surroundings. Many of the illustrations are work of art by John Douglas Woodward, like this one, or Harry Fenn, who made this of Jerusalem, the Damascus Gate. This gate was built in 1542 on the north side of the city. And this is how it looks today. It's quite amazing how he's rendered that quite accurately. Now, we've talked a lot about, for many, several unknown artists. And although they are skilled, we do like something recognizable, someone we may know a little about. What about the great artists in the world? Famous pictures like Rembrandt van Rijn. He made over 300 works inspired by stories from the Bible. And of these, approximately 60 are paintings. Here we see Samson's engagement party, where he's telling his mates a riddle that he wants them to solve. Another he painted was Jacob, the ancestor of the 12 tribes of Israel, blessing the sons of Joseph, little Manasseh and Ephraim. We see that Rembrandt also is not so careful about being historically correct. He has dressed those involved in contemporary clothing with Arabic, Arabic, what you call it, influence. It's not very likely that Joseph, having lived in Egypt, would have a turban or a mustache. When we know the way archaeology have dug up the fashions and traditions of that time, he was more likely to have a goatee, perhaps, as several of the pharaohs had. But it's not called artistic freedom for nothing. So collecting Rembrandt's pictures in a Bible, it was only done hundreds of years after the works were finished. Another familiar motif, the writing on the wall in Daniel, and Rembrandt had to learn a little Hebrew even. And it says, Mene, mene, tekel parsin. If you read it from right to left, it looks like 3 words, but you're supposed to read it from top to bottom. And then you see that the first 2 words are the same. Mene, mene. The situation is taken from the book of Daniel, and Belshazzar's days are numbered. He's weighed and found wanting. There's several proverbs from the Bible that have entered our everyday language. And the fact that Rembrandt had a major influence on art history is seen by this other artist, a Danish painter called Carl Bloch. And when I've written that this is sponsored by Carlsberg, you might like a pint of Carlsberg after this. It's not a joke, because Carlsberg, the man who founded the brewery, he was a benefactor of Bloch. He commissioned this painter to make 23 new paintings for the king, because his prayer room had burnt, so he wanted to help out decorating. This is then Jesus's life in 3 different stages. The first one when Mary visits Elizabeth, and the second when he's in the temple teaching inside the scribes and Pharisees, and the last one where he's looking out at Peter, because Peter has denied knowing him, and we can see that the rooster is calling out for the second time. Here's a funny way to enhance a Bible. You can only see this painting, this picture, when the Bible is opened. The Noah's Ark. When it's closed, you'll see just a golden edge. It's called a 4-edge painting. It's from 1858, also from Oxford. And the funny thing is, on the other side is another painting, different one, of Jericho, the walls of Jericho coming down. But you can see neither when the Bible is closed. The last Bible with art that we're going to look at today is called the New Illuminated Bible. It has 600 illustrations. It was published in 1898, an American Bible. And instead of highlighting the writing, as one did with gold to make the text shine, they emphasized that the illustrations should be educational and highlight the message. So we see the scapegoat, another phrase from the Bible that more often appears in the press these days. The scapegoat was sent into the desert, carrying the sins of Israel away from the camp. So, as a little conclusion, from illuminated manuscripts to one of the first Bibles of educational illustrations, art has emphasized the message of the Bible and helped readers to envision and be able to understand and appreciate its message. Just as Jesus used illustrations for people to understand spiritual things, it's written that without an illustration, he did not speak to them. But what about all the other artwork, you might say? What about the creation of Adam? What about The Deluge by William Turner? What about David and Goliath by Caravaggio? Or the wedding in Cana that Jesus attended and turned water into wine? Or the Last Supper? Or even Delacroix in Oslo, National Gallery in Norway? Or Vincent van Gogh's version, a copy after Delacroix's lithography? Or even The Incredulity of Thomas, also by Caravaggio. Amazing detail. Look at that facial expression of Thomas. Now, the Bible stories have really inspired many talented artists who've been able to move the onlookers with their version of events. Can you see art at the Nordic Bible Museum? Yes, you can. Here is a lithography, also inspired from the Bible, called The Potter, the hands of God creating mankind and recreating. And also a series of paintings by Doug Hull of different old Bibles. Now, it is our hope that this trip has also illustrated the love of the Bible that so many creative people have had through the last 2,000 years of history. The book is unprecedented in human history, and we have looked at one side of its history. Thank you ever so much for joining today.